Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. As I promised you last week, we're back to continue our conversation with Maury Allen, sportswriter extraordinaire for half a century. Maury Allen is truly an Isaac Asimov of sports writing. 2 million words in print, some 10,000 newspaper columns, 35 published books, several on the Yankees, and a few hundred magazine articles. The two most recently released books in March and April are Our Mickey, about the Mick, and Yankees, Where Have You Gone? You'll be surprised to know even who they are, let alone where they've gone. Welcome back.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Let's talk about chipmunks.
Right.
Who are these rodents? And I've interviewed several of these rodents. I almost feel like Alvin. Talk about the chipmunks.
That's right. Chipmunks were a group of sports writers, young sports writers in their late 20s who came along in the early 1960s. And there were about 8 or 10 of us that all came along together. And we were sort of the iconoclasts of our time. We didn't like the way sports was covered. We thought it was more important to get into a player's heart and head than it was how many doubles he hit or how many home runs he hit. And as a result, we got a nickname, the Chipmunks, which actually was given to us by Jimmy Cannon, a famous writer, who came up with the term because we chatted in the press box and we talked about issues other than the game. And so these sports writers, this group of young guys, really did change the coverage of all sports. And I guess the ultimate was examining the lives of these people, these athletes, which had really never been done in great depth up till that time, rather than their performance on a field. The rule used to be, when a guy does something off the field, you didn't write about it, you didn't care about it, you didn't know about it, and the reader, therefore, didn't get it. Our feeling was what happened on the field was rather incidental, and everybody knew the score of the game, and they knew the guy hit the home run. Who is this guy? What does he do? Who is he married to? What are his interests? What kind of person is he? What is his attitude towards the Vietnam War? This was also a very big thing in the 60s. And so this whole sort of new school of journalism developed.
Yeah, and one of the things you guys did were punctured the pretensions and the pomposities and really brought these sainted figures down to our levels. You have written that the 60s was the best time for a New York sports writer.
I think the 60s were one of the most unique times in American history generally. I mean, the war is going on, civil rights demonstrations are going on, there's a kind of cultural revolution, free love. Everything,
you got rioting in the cities.
Rioting in the cities. Everything is happening in America that was changing the country. So in effect, without sitting down and planning this, the young sports writers were part of this environment, so we changed the way the coverage had been for 50 years. You know, every lead in every newspaper up to our time was the Yankees beat the, whoever they beat, the Philadelphia A's, whatever it was, 4-2 on Joe DiMaggio's 3-run home run. And then we started to say, instead of somebody beating somebody, while the Yankees were beating somebody 4-2, this happened in a clubhouse, that happened in a clubhouse, this is what happened to the guy off the field, this is what his attitude was towards being a ball player instead of being a truck driver, and that became the essence of
Now let's go through the 60s. You've got the Yanks in the World 60s, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64. You've got the Jets winning in 69. You've got the Mets winning in 69. You've got the Knicks. You've got, well, in New York, you're there. You're in heaven.
Absolutely. And I think the thing that was most significant is while all these changes were going on in the country, the changes were also represented in sports. The attitudes were changing, the personalities were changing. When you mention the Jets, for example, you get a guy like Joe Namath coming along. A different type of character. The Mets winning, you have a Tug McGraw kind of character. You have a lot of oddballs. You have a Ron Swoboda, people like that. And the same thing with the Knicks teams. You get a Bill Bradley, the Princeton guy, kind of a square guy. But at the same time, you get a Clyde Frazier, dressing like the kind of person he was, Bonnie and Clyde. And I think all of this came together. And I think it was lucky for sports writing and lucky for readers that the Chipmunks went along with this, understood it, portrayed it. So at the same time, we were showing what life was like, but at the same time, we were showing the dramatic changes in our profession.
Okay. You've written that the hardest part of being a journalist, and particularly a sports journalist, was keeping your distance from the athletes. How did you balance that? And were there instances when you balanced it too much and kept them off, or were too close to them?
There are instances both ways, and I think what it is you must be fair and objective. You must be as honest as you could be. You must be as accurate as you could be. Well, when you get too personal with an athlete, you're going to bend the truth to make him look good. When you invite a guy to your house, it's very hard the next day to say the guy didn't hustle on a play. So there was that kind of conflict that went on all the time. And my best example of the negative side being too close, I was very friendly with Jim Bouton, the great author of Ball 4, later on, and he had a sore arm, and we were sitting around one day, and he just casually mentioned his arm bothered him and hurt him, and I think it was in some social situation. Of course, next day I raced to my typewriter, and I wrote this story about Jim Bouton having a sore arm. Well, he went crazy over that because it really was off the field, and I shouldn't have written it without telling him. But reporters work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That was a mistake on my part. The opposite side of the story was a rather famous story of two ball players who came to my house as guests, Fritz Peterson and Mike Kekich.
One of the great baseball stories of all time.
We had a barbecue. It was very nice. They had a little more to drink than probably people should drink or that I drank. And then they left my house together, and they went to a motel where they switched wives. And the next morning, Fritz Peterson called me up, and he said, "Maury, I have to tell you this. We decided to switch wives and kids and cars and dogs."
The whole 9 yards.
The whole 9 yards. And he said, he wanted me to write the story, Fritz did, because I would write it tastefully. I said, tastefully? I said, you idiot. Keep your mouth shut, do what you want, but you don't have to tell anybody. And he danced around it for a couple of months, and then finally when he went to spring training, he got another reporter to write it. There was Milton Richmond of the United Press, and I recommended that he give it to him. It would be out, and that was it. And I knew this was coming, so for the first time in my professional life, I ducked an assignment, and I said to my editor at the Post, I said, I'd rather not go to spring training with the Yankees. There's going to be an explosive story, and I happen to be involved in it, and I don't want to be part of the news. I'm a reporter. And he didn't press me, and he said, okay, you go cover the Mets, and then when the story breaks, you'll write something about it afterwards, and that's the way it worked out.
It was a bombshell of a story.
Absolute
it was front page news. Forget about sports page.
You have to remember, this happened in the early 70s, and this was a tremendous shock to everybody's system that ball players would do such things, that they would switch wives, that they would have extramarital affairs, and they would make it public. And that's what these guys wanted to do.
Switch your whole family, including the door in the car, the dog in the car. Forget it. Okay, let's get to Mickey. As perhaps as an illustration of the closeness sometimes a sports writer gets. You've written now 3 books on Mickey. Tragic character.
Mickey was a tragic character from a standpoint of not fulfilling the God-given athletic skill.
I remember.
Yeah. I mean, there was no ball player that ever came around, from Babe Ruth to Joe DiMaggio to Taylor, to anybody, that had the incredible God-given physical talent. He could run faster than anybody, hit the ball further than anybody, catch a ball better than anybody, hit the highest, longest home runs than anybody hit. And he was going to be, Superman with a Yankee uniform
I was
on.
Yankee fan.
Right.
He was forget about Willie and the Duke. It was the Mick.
And what happened in effect is that he couldn't handle the level of fame that this talent gave him, and so he retreated in a way to drinking, to chasing women, to living an immoral life, and to not getting the proper rest. So his talent really was diminished. And even though he had a great career, a Hall of Fame career, he didn't hit 300, which was one of his great regrets.
Yeah, 298.
298, but he was such a dramatic personality. And again, in this era, people don't realize how big and how beloved a sports star of the 50s took on. And you have to remember, there wasn't a lot of television in those days. The Yankees would be on Game of the Week, which was one game on Saturday, and almost every week it was always a Yankee game, and almost every week it was Mickey Mantle hitting a home run. The other thing about him, Doug, was sort of fascinating from the standpoint of his persona. He looked like the American dream hero. He was blonde. He was blue-eyed. He was incredibly handsome. He had a perfect smile. He had the perfect athletic body. He had the perfect-looking wife. He had 4 wonderful sons. He had this name, this resonant name, Mickey Mantle. I mean, the whole thing just fit as if a fiction writer sat down and said, I'm going to create the perfect figure for the 1950s, and he created Mickey Mantle.
Let me just interrupt for a second. You tell in one of the books of the story of Mantle and when he comes up in 51 and Joe DiMaggio's response to him.
Joe DiMaggio was a very self-centered and in a way insecure person. And in 1951, despite his standing and knowing his greatest player of his time, he saw this young kid as a terrible threat. All the attention in 1951 in spring training, I was not there yet, it was a little before my time, but I talked to many of the people who were there, was all about this kid DiMaggio. And he was hitting home runs. The Yankees trained in Arizona that year. He hit 18 home runs in spring training. And all this fuss over Mantle. And he hit one home run that people said went 650 feet. And so all the fuss was over this new kid, Mantle, while DiMaggio was on his last year, and instead of being fussed over because it was last year and appreciated, nobody cared about it. He was old news. They had written everything they could possibly write about DiMaggio. Of course, this is before Maryland. But anyway, they were writing about Mantle, and I think DiMaggio became very resentful, and he never really accepted Mantle on a team. And the ultimate, which cost Mickey a lot of his career,
right, physically,
was the injury in 51 in a World Series when he said to Mantle before the game, you kid, you catch everything you can catch in right center field that's near us. And Willie Mays hits a ball to right center field, and Mantle goes over fast. Plenty of time to catch the ball, and at the last second, DiMaggio decides, well, he's going to catch the ball because it's center field, and I'm the owner of center field, and he yells Mantle off, and Mantle can't stop in time, and he stops short, hits a drainage ditch, wrecks his knee, and never could run again.
And this is one of the great what-ifs. As a Yankee fan and a Mantle fan, I remember him, even after the knee injury, dropping bunts down the third baseline and blowing up that first baseline with a bad knee.
With a bad knee.
It was always the argument that he was if you were a Yankee fan, he was the best. He was better than Ted Williams.
No
he was better than Willie.
I mean, the argument in New York was Willie, Mickey, and the Duke.
Right.
Willie Mays, Mickey Mantle, Duke Snider.
Right.
But Mickey was clearly the best of them when he came into the game. But by the time of the injury, the drinking, the other injuries, he broke his ankle, and he had several major injuries through his career. Willie Mays emerged as really the best of those three players.
But on the upside, in the great home run race in '61, Mantle could have played almost the DiMaggio role to Maris, but didn't.
Mickey Mantle was an exceptional human being. not so much an exceptional player, an exceptional human being. By that he means he welcomed the competition of Maris. He helped Maris. They were friends. I mean, the rumor started they were enemies. That was ridiculous. These were two guys who were absolutely close friends. They actually lived together in an apartment in your native Queens, where they lived together and they shared everything. And Mantle eased the transition of Maris from an out-of-town player to a New York heroic figure. And they rooted for each other. And Mantle's dream, as he told me that season in July or sometime, they both wanted to hit more than 60 home runs. He didn't care who broke the record, whether it was himself or Maris, but the idea that both of them would hit 61, 62 home runs was what they wanted to do. And unfortunately, Mickey lost actually 3 weeks at the end of the season, and Roger, damaged by the pressure, sort of slumped and slowed down, and finally on the last day of the season, hit the 61st. And here's a little irony
Tracy
about
Stallard,
it.
you never forget these
Tracy
things.
Stallard gave up the last home run. Mickey was in Lenox Hill Hospital, cried when he saw it on television. 25 years later, I do a book on Roger Maris, and I go back to Mickey, and we relive the event. And as he's telling the same story, watching Roger come to bat against Tracy Stallard in the hotel room, in a Plaza Hotel, Mickey burst into tears. The emotion was so overwhelming. So I said, Mickey, is it because you didn't hit the home run, or because Roger hit it, and Roger was gone at that time, and the emotion? He said, no, just living through it again was so overwhelming for me, I couldn't control myself.
Let's talk about another home run, the last home run Mickey ever hit. And I wasn't there at the game, but saw the game. Great honorable pitch. Talk about it.
Denny McLain, you're talking about. Denny McLain, 30-game winner in 1968, and he gives up he tells Mickey through the catcher. He's on the mound, he's pitching, he's got another win, he's going to win his 29th, I think that was, and he tells the catcher to tell Mickey, I'm going to lay one in and Mickey can hit it. Mickey, of course, didn't believe it. He started being put on, and he throws a nice soft pitch, and Mickey fouls it off. He throws another pitch, and Mickey fouls it off. And then Mickey goes like this. In other words, get it up a little higher
in his wheelhouse,
if you want me to hit it. And he throws it, perfect speed, 85 miles an hour, right in the perfect spot. Mickey hits it, and he rounds third base, and they sort of wink at each other and nod at each other. And the kick into the story was the next batter was Joe Pepitone, and he comes up to the plate, and he goes like this to Denny McLain, like he wants to say right in his head, right down.
I know. I mean, there's only one of those pitches.
But that showed the affection that everybody had for Mickey Mantle.
And it really was.
Two things were very unique about Mickey Mantle. He was loved by his teammates more than anybody who had ever played the game, and he was loved by the opposition players more than anybody who ever played the game. And all those relationships stayed with Mickey throughout his life, and it was just a very warm thing to see that these players cared so much about him, and that Mickey related to the lowest player on the team the same way he related to the stars, where DiMaggio had no time for the low players.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier is that, they lived in Queens. The ball players at that time lived in the neighborhoods. And they, in off-season, oftentimes worked in the neighborhoods. So there was a much greater connection physically with the ball players, whether they were the Dodgers, Giants, or Yankees. They lived here. They were part of us in a way that it is not.
Yeah, now they all have big mansions out in the suburbs. Nobody sees them except their own.
The class distinctions weren't there.
The Brooklyn Dodger players, for example, all lived in the same neighborhood in Bay Ridge and Brooklyn.
Right, and you could see them on, my mother used to say you could see them on the street.
Right, the Yankees lived in a Concourse Plaza in the Bronx. Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig used to walk from the Concourse Plaza, to Yankee Stadium, 4 blocks, 5 blocks, whatever it was. And in the other book that I did, Yankees, Where Have You Gone, I pointed out these are players of the 60s, and when they made $12,000 a year and $14,000 a year, they had jobs in the off season, and they had to make money to support their family. And the day they retired from baseball, they immediately got real jobs, plumbers and construction workers,
operators,
tugboat operators, carpet salesmen, because ball players made the same salaries that all the rest of us make.
Absolutely. I just have to go to this. I picked this up, and it's one of these books that you have to buy. And it says, "Where have you gone?" And it says, "Catching up with Dooley Womack, Tommy Henrik, Sparkly Lyle, and other Yankees." When I saw Dooley Womack, I had to buy it. But just some of the people that any fans out there want to know about is Hal Reniff.
Right.
I mean, of course. Frank Tepedino.
Right.
I mean, these are some classics. Horace Clark. Now, Horace Clark was on that really awful Yankee team.
He was the representative of the worst Yankee team and the worst Yankee era ever. Which was the late 60s into the 70s.
Horrible.
An average player. You know, I mean, he was not a great player, of course, but he was not a terrible player.
No.
He played the major leagues for 10, 12 years, so that was
Right, and it wasn't that
nice.
bad, but I mean, there were some players here that...
You mentioned Dooley Womack.
No, you have to talk about Dooley Womack. Go ahead.
Dooley Womack was the best pitcher on the worst team in Yankee history. He had the best ERA in the 66 Yankees that finished
that was such
in
a
10th
terrible-
place.
they
They
were
actually
so
had a 10th
bad.
place. But the
They were
great
bad.
thing about Dooley Womack is he joins the Yankees in 66, and I go up to him, and he's listed on a roster as Dooley Womack. And what is a Dooley Womack?
It's a thing,
You
right,
go
it's
up
not a
to him, I
person.
got to find out. And then he says, "No, my real name is Horace Guy Womack, and I've always been called Dooley." And I said, he's from South Carolina. I said, "How did you get the name?" And in his southern drawl, he said, "I don't know. I don't know how I got the name." His mother knew somebody by the name of Dool for whatever reason. And when he was a little kid, she just started to call him Dooley. She knew nothing about where it came from. So now I go back. This is 2003, and I'm interviewing Dooley Womack. Of course, what's my first question? "Dooley, did you ever find out where your name came from?"
Did he? No.
He said, "No, I have no idea, and everybody calls me
How
Dooley."
did you had so much fun doing this. I mean, the problem with you guys is that you all have too much fun.
Right.
Much too much fun. Well, how did you get this idea?
Yeah, the idea was that maybe the salary things just sort of got out of hand. And I wanted to remind readers and listeners what it was like to be a ball player in the 30s, 40s, 50s. The fact that they had these off-season jobs, the fact that they didn't make any money, and the fact that one thing that linked all these guys together, the 50 players that I picked, they wore the Yankee uniform, and that changed their lives. Even if they were there for 10 minutes. There was a player like Allie Clark, only played 1 year with the Yankees.
Well, I mean, when I read it, it was
Right.
one of those names I simply didn't recognize.
There's another interesting story in the book. I mean, I think they're all interesting, but this one fascinated me personally. Bill Werber. Bill Werber is
That was another one I
95
didn't
years
know.
old. 95 years old. He played in the World Series in 1940 with the Cincinnati Reds. He was a very good third baseman in Cincinnati. But he actually started his professional career as a college kid in 1927 with the
that great
greatest
team
Yankee team of
ever.
all time.
Best baseball
he
team
wasn't
ever.
signed because he was still in college, and they had a rule in those days you couldn't sign, but you could work out. He worked out and traveled with the Yankees, and he played cards with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Bill Dickey, and he told all these stories of playing with them. And he said the most interesting thing is that Gehrig and Ruth really didn't have a very close relationship. And he said Ruth always brought a bottle of whiskey to a card game, and he'd start drinking, and about halfway through the bottle, he got a little rowdy and a little loud, and then Gehrig would announce, who was a straight-laced guy, "Okay, the game is over after this hand." In other words, as soon as Ruth drank too much, that was the end of the game. And Bill Werber said it was really interesting to see their relationship, and he said Bill Werber, was not particularly close to Gehrig. He said because Gehrig was only close to one person in those days, that was his mother.
Before we only have 3 minutes to go, George Steinbrenner, book All Roads Lead to October. You have uncommon, if not unique, access to the boss among all sports writers. Why and how?
What really happened is when he came to the Yankees in '73 and he said, "I'm going to be on the sidelines and Gabe Paula run the team," nobody believed it. And I started to talk to him about it, and I knew he was a great fan. And through the years, I've respected what he's done. Sure, he's done some damaging things, and he gets criticized for firing and how tough he is and how nasty he can be around the club. But the bottom line is he brought the Yankees back. Some of us remember what the Yankees were like under CBS in the 60s and early 70s, how boring they were, how terrible. He spent money. Right. He made a lot of money, of course, but he also put a lot of money into that team. And when you're a Yankee fan today, you have this tremendous pride. You know you're going to be in a World Series, and it's all George Steinbrenner's doing. And I think he deserves enormous credit for what he's done.
What does he talk to you, though?
He just finds me a comfortable guy and maybe a fair guy to talk to, and I find him a very interesting and bright guy. What he is the ultimate fan who happens to own the team. He happens to have the money, but he roots like a fan. And by that, the definition of a fan is when they win, he loves them, the Yankees. When he loses, he hates them. He wants to trade every guy. Didn't we always say
do the
his
same
kids?
thing, right? Excuse me, I do that now.
The only difference is he owns it. We don't.
Oh, man. 1 minute, real quick. We have to do this again. State of baseball.
I think baseball is still in pretty good state. It's still loved as much as always by kids. They have problems, I mean, with the steroids, the money, the salaries. But once the game starts and it's between the lines, it's still the most thrilling sport. And it also is a sport that everybody can identify with because you don't have to be 6'8", and you don't have to be 290 pounds. Every average kid in America, male, could play. And I tell you another thing, this is my personal prediction.
Forget about male.
There's going to be a female playing in the big leagues.
Are you kidding me? Not only softball, but baseball as well.
Absolutely.
My daughter played baseball. It is the sport. Steroids permanently damaging to the sport?
I think we're going through a stage, but I think there's been enough fuss over it, and it's a warning, and I think people will back off.
Alex Rodriguez.
Great player. Whether or not he's a New York player, I think still has to be determined.
What's a New York player?
A New York player is a guy that can relate to the fans, relate to the crowds, understand the emotion that people put into this team, and, of course, lead them to the World Series. And if he does that, then he's a New York player.
The most important.